This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Orbis.
Today we welcome Dmitri Alperovitch to the podcast. Dmitri is a prominent figure in the cybersecurity and geopolitical landscape. He is the co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike, and now the executive chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit focused on American prosperity and global leadership. He serves on the Homeland Security Advisory Council and the Cyber Safety Review Board, and has established the Alperovitch Institute for Cybersecurity Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Beyond his corporate endeavors, Alperovitch is an author and commentator on geopolitical affairs. His latest book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, offers an analysis of the intensifying U.S.-China rivalry and its potential implications for global stability. He outlines the actions the U.S. and its allies can take to prevent a potential conflict with China while maintaining global leadership. We'll be right back with Dmitri Alperovitch.
Rooted in the U.S. intelligence and special operations communities, Orbis is investing today in the people and capabilities needed to deliver national security tomorrow. Data is everywhere and easy to acquire. The intelligence mission requires new thinking and new approaches to make the most of that data. That's where Orbis is making a difference. Unburdened by legacy business models, we're building the intelligence business of the future. We provide highly empowered, creative teams that deliver impactful outcomes and asymmetric capabilities for our clients worldwide. If you're looking for a strategic ally with experience navigating the complexities of the modern information environment, or if you envision contributing your unique experiences to elevate global security, then we're ready for you. Connect with us at intelligencematters@orbis.com. That's intelligencematters@orbis.com. Uncover the extraordinary with Orbis.
Dmitri, welcome to Intelligence Matters. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I guess we've got a lot to cover today, so let's just dive in and start sort of talking about the cyber security landscape. And maybe a place to begin is, how do you see the landscape, especially nation-state cyber operations, has evolved since you first identified Chinese military hackers in Operation Aurora back in 2010? And maybe you can start by saying what Operation Aurora was, and then we can start talking about the evolution and the threats.
Sure. So Aurora was a pretty groundbreaking event. It was a hack into Google and about 24 other companies across the spectrum of technology companies, defense companies, chemical manufacturing companies, etc. And it was really the first time that anyone realized that you had nation states that were infiltrating private companies for the purposes of stealing intellectual property, collecting intelligence on dissidents, and the like. And of course, since Operation Aurora, we've seen just an avalanche of activity that is now regularly attributed by the U.S. government. At the time, back in 2010, this was pretty unprecedented. The U.S. government would, for 4 years, basically provide a no comment on whether this was going on or not. Of course, they had the intelligence all along that this was taking place, both from China and other nation states. And in 2014, for the first time, they did an indictment of the PLA officers that were responsible for at least some of this activity that was taking place. And basically from that point forward, you've seen just a nonstop slew of indictments and public attributions from the U.S. government of Chinese actors, Russian actors, Iranian actors, North Korean actors. They were infiltrating private companies, government agencies, stealing everything that's not bolted down. So we still have that problem. It has not gotten any better, I'm sorry to say. But what we have now, since around 2020, so for the last 4 years, is something that is even more disturbing, which is now you're seeing, particularly from China, Chinese nation-state actors, those that are believed to be affiliated with the PLA, Chinese military, breaking into organizations that don't have any valuable intelligence to steal. I'm talking about organizations like pipelines and water utilities and electric utilities. And the U.S. intelligence community assesses that this activity that is labeled Volt Typhoon is actually preparations for potentially disruptive and destructive attacks that the PLA could launch either in the lead up or during a conflict with the United States, potentially over Taiwan. So you still have this massive theft that's going on, both intellectual property and trade secret theft, economic espionage. You still have, obviously, national security espionage. But now you have really blackmail or deterrence activity, however you want to label it, that's taking place from China in particular to try to influence U.S. policy.
Yeah. So Dmitri, during and we'll talk about the Cold War here in a few minutes, but during the Cold War, nuclear weapons, there was this, mad doctrine, mutual assured destruction, right? If you're going to use them on us, we'll use them on you, and no one wins kind of mentality. Is there a point at which that's also will apply to cyber tools? I mean, if we start, if it really starts to, they close down utilities, we can fire back and try to see if we can close their utilities. They close a bank, we close a bank. At what point does this sort of escalate to where it gets out of hand, as opposed to it's already bad, the IP theft and so on and so forth? Do you see it on that kind of a ladder, or is that a not a good analogy?
Yeah, I don't love that analogy because nuclear weapons are, of course, in a realm of their own, right? They're civilization-destroying, planet-destroying weapons, potentially, right, if used at scale. Cyber is not that, right? You're seeing this in the conflict in Ukraine, where the Russians have launched a torrent of cyber attacks against that country, both since the invasion in February of 2022, but even predating it. And none of that have actually had a strategic effect, right? Yes, sometimes ATMs get shut down. Sometimes you have a temporary blackout in the electric power distribution. But of course, we're seeing that the Russians realize that doesn't actually accomplish strategic objectives of getting the Ukrainians to surrender. And they actually had to escalate the campaign to a kinetic one, where they're now regularly bombing these facilities in order to permanently destroy them, which is not possible in cyberspace. So we have to be cognizant that while cyber absolutely can generate effects, that they're fleeting and are actually much better used for really a prelude to something else, right? So an access campaign where you're taking out electric power in a particular region because you want to accomplish something else there. Where, for example, if you're taking out an electric utility that supplies an air defense battery and you're about to do a kinetic strike and you want to make sure that battery is not operating, that's where cyber can play a significant role. I liken cyber much more to an EW, electronic warfare capability, where it's very powerful and very important in a tactical sense, but it's really not a strategic capability.
So, Dmitri, as we think about sort of cybersecurity, it's hard not to think about where we are today with AI. It's sort of really burst on the scene over the last couple of years. So, how do you see AI in the cybersecurity landscape? What are the either benefits or risks? I know it depends on whether you're playing offense or defense of AI-driven cybersecurity. Yeah,
this is a great question. And of course, AI, or machine learning as it was called before, the last few years, has been around in cyber for many decades. I first started using it in the cyber domain back in 2003 timeframe. So just to give you a sense of how both old I am and how old this technology has been around. The generative AI capability driven by sort of these neural nets, deep learning systems, are obviously another layer above what we've seen before. And they're going to be used, and they're already being used, both on offensive and defensive side. And, cybersecurity fundamentally is such an interesting science. It is one of the few applied sciences out there where you're never done, right? There's never going to be a moment where we'll say, we've solved this, we're moving on. It's a finished field, because you're dealing with a sentient opponent, right? In medicine, for example, you can imagine a situation where a particular cancer, some researchers are working on it for decades, and one day they'll solve it, where you have a treatment, you have drugs or whatever that will basically make this condition no longer life-threatening. In cyber, that will never happen, because as long as there are bad people out there that wish to do us harm, they will figure out a way around any of the defenses that we put in place, right? So it's a never-ending cat and mouse game, and any technology that comes along, like generative AI, will be used by both sides. So you're already seeing some integrations of generative AI in defensive technologies, where one of the things that has been changing in the cyber domain in the last 15 years or so is that it's become much more of a data play where you're trying to aggregate data across all the different sensors that you have in your network, for example. And of course, it's too much data for any human to analyze. So using machine learning techniques and generative AI techniques to make sense of it, to empower analysts to find malicious activity, to respond to it quickly is very powerful. And then on the offensive side, it is also now being used by malicious actors to do better social engineering attacks, where using better crafted emails to target people, to get them to click on links that will introduce malicious code into their systems can be a very powerful capability for them. Or, now with the advent of audio and video deepfakes, you can actually have a much more compelling social engineering attack via voice or a Zoom call, where you can get someone to give up their sensitive information.
So just to your note about AI, when I was in graduate school, we were building expert systems, which were going to be the way that we're going to, doctors would, automate their ability to make diagnoses and all that. So it was a very long time ago. And at that point, AI was just around the corner, right? For the longest time, it seemed to be just around the corner, right? Till suddenly, over the last couple of years, it really has come into its own. We live in a really fraught time with, geopolitical tensions probably at a high, between major powers. So can we talk about, how that influences the global cybersecurity landscape? And, you get the sense we talked a little bit about how it may affect, government to government, but there's also a broader impact to businesses and organizations. So how do you see those two things tied? That's
another great question. And, I coined this phrase over a decade ago that is now often repeated by various government officials, that we don't actually have a cyber problem. We have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem, of which cyber is just an element of this overall great power struggle that we have with countries like China and obviously with rogue nations like Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the landscape of various countries, we have over 180 different countries that are in the United Nations. Many of them, in fact, probably now the majority of them, have some sort of cyber capability that they either indigenously developed or acquired from various, arms dealers in cyberspace, like the NSO Group, for example. And the reality is that we, for the most part, either as American citizens or working for American businesses or American government, don't worry about most of them, right? We don't spend our nights concerned about what Singapore is going to do to us, or Germany, or the United Kingdom, because we have friendly relations and understandings with those nations. But it's not an accident that the four nations that we see the most number of particularly state-directed attacks, in fact, virtually all of them, are coming from these four: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, because those are the four primary actors on the global stage that we have fundamental geopolitical struggles with. So they're using cyber as an asymmetric way to try to achieve their objectives, in addition to other things, in the case of Iran, terrorism and economic warfare and so forth. But this is just an element of that overall struggle, and cyber cannot be disconnected from geopolitics. And even when it comes to criminal groups and hackers, so much of this activity is also emanating from these four countries, not because they have a monopoly on cybercrime, but simply because whenever cyber criminals are operating from other countries with whom we have good relations and extradition treaties and the like, they typically get discovered and arrested. And of course, in those four countries in particular, they're allowed to prosper and operate with impunity. In some ways, this is the ultimate asymmetric weapon. It's one of them. I mean, I think terrorism probably is the ultimate one, but this is definitely one that is deniable to a great extent, even though attribution has gotten so much better in cyber and most of these attacks are being attributed all the time. The other country can simply deny it, and most of the attribution is done in the classified world with sensitive intelligence, and you're not going to disclose it for fears of jeopardizing sources and methods. So as a result, some will never believe you. And the technology is ubiquitous. So, anybody who wants to get their hands on it, can. It's not,
building a modern fighter aircraft kind of thing.
Yeah, and the other thing that's changing is that you have more and more integration between the physical and the cyber systems, right? It's no longer just a computer in your office that you want to target. It's the systems that are connected to the internet sometimes, or connected to other networks that are connected to the internet, that operate your pipelines, that operate your chemical plants, that operate your electricity, and you can actually have physical world effects if you try to shut them down.
So this is a great lead into just maybe talk for a few minutes about how you might see the future of warfare, especially with the increasing integration of technology, AI, cyber attack capabilities. How do you see those reshaping the future of warfare? I know in your book, World on the Brink, you discuss how economic warfare has become a primary battlefield between nations. So how do you see this sort of the cyber domain, the traditional warfare, economic warfare intersecting in future conflicts?
Well, one thing that I think are seeing these days and have been seen for some time now is that the line between you're at war and you're at peace is blending, right? You now have increasingly this gray zone warfare where we're not at war with Russia, but of course we're supplying weapons to Ukraine that is at war with Russia, and Russia is engaging in sabotage operations, assassination campaigns in the West, etc. So this is not definitely peace, but it's also not outright warfare. And it is in that gray zone where you have the most benefit that you can achieve, I think, in cyberspace, because you can launch these attacks with some level of deniability. Even if other side knows that it's you can deny it, and extract economic pain on them through espionage, economic espionage, but also through disruption. And one of the biggest threats right now in terms of impact to this country is ransomware. Ransomware attacks that are being directed mostly, not exclusively, but mostly by gangs in Russia. Some of them state-supported, some of them operating with impunity, with the Russian state aware that they're operating against us, and they're targeting hospitals, they're targeting small businesses, police departments, schools, you name it, and having a real impact on and extracting real costs on companies that, of course, pay a ransom, or even if they don't pay a ransom, the recovery costs can be quite substantial. So all of that is part of this, gray zone warfare that's being waged against us, and we're largely not responding to it. We haven't really done much against China in response to its economic warfare against us that's been lasting over 2 decades now, since the early 2000s. They've been doing this against us, right? We haven't really done much against these ransomware gangs in Russia or North Korea or Iran that have done all this activity to us. So, we've responded in other ways with tariffs and sanctions, for other nefarious activity that these regimes have waged against us. But in cyber, we've really limited dramatically our responses to indictments, which are great signaling tools, but really not super effective, because for the most part, you're not going to be able to get these people arrested, because these countries, of course, will never extradite them. And maybe you'll get them when they travel to Thailand or Spain on vacations, but increasingly they're aware of the dangers of that and are restricting their travel.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Dmitri.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So, Dmitri, at the beginning, I mentioned your Silverado policy accelerator. As we think about the fact, what you just said, that maybe we have not responded as we could, are there specific policy changes that you believe would be most effective to strengthen U.S. cybersecurity? What do you think needs to happen from a policy perspective, not just a technology perspective, to make us more robust or resilient?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we have to be much more aggressive on offense. The reality is that the offensive capabilities in the U.S. intelligence community at the National Security Agency, the NSA, the CIA, and others are absolutely incredible and far above the capabilities of any other nation state out there, including Russia and China. But we also have a really, really high correlation of operatives to lawyers in those agencies, and their ability to engage in these offensive operations is highly restricted, highly regulated. Sometimes for good reasons. We don't want to cause pain to civilians. We don't want to commit war crimes. But I think there's a lot more we can do in cyber to inflict damage and to send a message to these countries that you can play this game, and we're also highly capable. We're currently using, of course, that capability for espionage and collecting intelligence on our adversaries. But from an effects perspective, there's a lot more that we could do that would send a message and retaliate potentially against their critical infrastructure economies in response to the attacks on us. So that's one thing. The other thing is using full powers of our economic warfare toolkit, sanctions, export controls, entities lists to bring real harm, particularly to the beneficiaries of the stolen IP in the case of China in particular, right? There are huge numbers of companies in China that have benefited from the stolen IP, the IP that was stolen by the Chinese government and provided to them. And why are we still allowing those companies to not just operate, but have access to our markets, to the Western markets, to our banking systems? They should be sanctioned and driven out of business to send a message, not just to the governments, but to the companies that may decide to benefit from this in the future, that if you do so, we will drive you out of business unless you play fair.
So, you've you referenced China just now, and we talked a bit about it a little earlier, And in your book, you draw an interesting parallel between Taiwan and West Berlin during the Cold War. Can you sort of elaborate on that and the significance of Taiwan at sort of a critical flashpoint today?
Yeah. So in my book, in World on the Brink, I talk about how we are, I believe, unquestionably in a Cold War II with China. A Cold War that is actually remarkably similar on virtually every level to the first Cold War, right? And let me just run you through the similarities. You have a global competition for supremacy that's playing out in every domain in every corner of the world, right? Between the United States and China, just like we had one between the Soviet Union and the United States during the first Cold War. It's playing out in the geopolitical sphere, in the diplomatic sphere, in the economic sphere, in the technological sphere. You have it playing out not just in Asia, but of course in Europe and Africa and Latin America, you name it. You have real preparations for war. If you go visit Pearl Harbor, the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command, the command that's in charge of our military operations in that region, they're getting ready for war, right? Admiral Papar, I met with him recently. His hair is on fire about the potential for conflict with China. And of course, the Chinese have been preparing for war with the United States for many decades, and this Volt Typhoon stuff that we just talked about in cyber domain is just more evidence of those preparations that they're undertaking. We have an arms race, both a conventional arms race with the buildup in military capabilities on the Chinese side and our side, and a nuclear one, where China, for the first time in many decades, is dramatically ramping up their nuclear arsenal, going from a steady number of about 300 warheads to about 1,500 to achieve parity with us. By the mid-2030s, they're already at 500 and will be at 1,000 probably by the end of this decade. You have a scramble for bases in the region, in particular, where the United States, of course, is getting access to bases in the Philippines for the first time in 32 years since we pulled out in 1992. You have the Chinese establishing bases in Cambodia and Pakistan, even in Djibouti. You have a space race, right? The defining moment of the first Cold War was a race to the moon, and here we are again trying to get to the moon before the Chinese do, hopefully this decade, and maybe on to Mars from there. You have an economic war that's being conducted, largely in cyber, as we've just discussed, but also with tariffs and trade restrictions. You have a spy war. The level of espionage against our country is at the highest level it's ever been, according to the FBI, far exceeding anything we had seen during the first Cold War, in large part because of the power of cyber and the amplifying effect it can have. The technology war that's being waged, where we're trying to restrict access to advanced technologies like AI and advanced semiconductors so that the Chinese don't make progress there, is really important. And the fight over TikTok that you've seen over last year. And an ideological struggle as well, where, of course, China is a communist country, but it's not quite communism versus capitalism that you have, but certainly authoritarianism versus democratic societies, an alliance of these authoritarian regimes that you've seen in the last couple of years since the invasion of Ukraine between China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. And as you mentioned, the regional flashpoint that was West Berlin during the first Cold War, where people have forgotten now because, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis is so seared in our memories, but the West Berlin was actually the most dangerous place during the first Cold War, at least for the first 15 or so years of that first Cold War, starting with the Berlin airlift in the late 1940s, where the Soviet Union tried to blockade West Berlin. And we said no under President Truman, and we executed this incredible airlift to try to have the population there survive starvation. It continued on through the 1950s, and then in 1961, you had this incredibly dangerous moment where Khrushchev, in his meeting with Kennedy in Vienna in the summer of 1961, basically threatened to invade West Berlin and push the United States and our allies out. And Kennedy went on American television that summer and said, "We're going to war. We're including nuclear war with the Soviet Union if they attempt to do this. West Berlin is that critical to us." And basically started preparing the country for conflict, asked money from Congress to find fallout shelters, nuclear fallout shelters across the country and so forth. Really, really dangerous moment. Now that place is Taiwan. That's regional flashpoint. The one place, I think, where the United States and China could potentially go to war. We're not going to go to war with them over some rocks, uninhibited rocks in South China Sea, Second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, or Senkaku Islands, these rocks in the East China Sea. But Taiwan is very, very strategic to us and to the world economy as the place that produces over 90% of all advanced chips, but even more importantly, 40% of all chips, period. And very, very important to China as well, right? And China has, of course, wanted to take Taiwan for many decades, but now Xi Jinping has become much more aggressive and accelerating the timeline. We know CIA Director Burns said a few years ago that he has given the order to the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. He has said on a number of occasions that this is not a problem that can be passed on to future generations. The man, by the way, just turned 70 this June, so do the actuarial math and think about how long it might take for him to pass power to the future generations. So I believe that this decade is going to be incredibly dangerous, particularly the period of 2028 through 2032, when he might relinquish power. In 2032, his likely fourth term will expire. A 5-year term he'll likely get in 2027. He'll be 79. In Chinese system, unlike ours, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their late 70s, early 80s. So this is the point in which he may go for Taiwan, and we might potentially find ourselves in a war with China, a war that we have not fought, the likes of which we have not fought really since World War II, perhaps even ever, because, of course, China is a nuclear power.
So, Dmitri, I agree with you on the Cold War II. I'm not sure Americans think about it that way because of all the economic interconnections. Everything you buy has made in China on it. I think one of the big challenges, of course, is the difference is that I don't think since the Revolutionary War the U.S. has faced a technological superpower, military superpower, and economic superpower all in one. Certainly the Soviet Union was never an economic superpower. Nazi Germany was not an economic superpower. So the stakes are even higher. It strikes me.
I'll quibble you a little bit. China for sure has the economic heft that the Soviet Union did not have. But on every other level, I believe it's actually much, much weaker than the Soviet Union ever was, right? First of all, it does not have the ideological attraction that the Soviet Union had, with communist parties everywhere being in strong alliance with the Soviet Union and having really, this second world confronting the first world during the first Cold War. China, yes, has this alliance, if you can even call it that. It's a very transactional relationship with China, with North Korea, with Iran. But who are its other allies, right? It has trade relationships with other countries. But even BRICS, there's a lot of tensions. India is in the BRICS. And of course, just a few years ago, they fought a small border conflict with India. So it does not have that power of alliances. It doesn't have a Warsaw Pact, a strong military alliance that we were confronting, particularly in Europe. It doesn't have the geopolitical heft of the Soviet Union that was the largest landmass on Earth and stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. It does not have the military power of the Soviet Union that truly had a blue water navy that could traverse the world's oceans, had an enormous military potential, particularly on the continent of Europe. So on virtually every other level, China, I think, is weaker. Yes, it has economic heft, but by the way, that economic power is completely dependent on exports to the United States, Europe, and others who are increasingly in a confrontational position vis-a-vis China. Its growth is declining. Its population is declining. I do not believe that China is a rising power. I think its power has likely already peaked, and it's in an ongoing decline. So, I don't understand people that hesitate from calling this a Cold War, because first and foremost, it clearly is one. I don't know how anyone can argue that we're not in one. But secondly, we have a pretty good track record of winning Cold Wars, at least the first one. And I think we're facing an adversary that is even weaker than the one we faced in the first one.
So you touched on an interesting point, and that's the way China sort of makes friends is either by buying them, it seems, or coercion, which gives the free world a big advantage because we tend to sort of cooperate more than China or communist countries, authoritarian countries do. Is this the strength? Is this the thing that we need to play on? Do you think? I mean, it just strikes me that not everyone is. We talked about Americans maybe not sort of seeing this as a Cold War, but then if you look more broadly across the world, except for maybe people that are in the neighborhood, it seems to be a long way to go. Do you think?
First and foremost, in the neighborhood, you have China really having confrontational relationships with virtually every single one of its neighbors. It has border disputes with virtually everyone. It solved them with Russia in the last couple of decades, but with virtually everyone else, it has conflicts, particularly in the South China Sea and East China Sea. And it's increasingly being a bully on the world stage. I'll tell you a quick story. I go to Munich Security Conference every year, this confab of defense officials and foreign secretaries. And I was this year at the forum in a roundtable discussion on supply chains, where China was a participant, India was a participant, the United States, and others. And you had this incredible moment where it began with the Indian official simply talking about how India is open for business, it's manufacturing iPhones, it's welcoming to other nations to put their supply chains in India. And the Chinese representative responds by turning to the Indian representative and saying, first and foremost, that they have to band together as developing countries, that all these other Western nations around the table are against them, and they have to stick together. And then immediately turning to the rest of the table and slamming India and saying no one should be going to India, that China has all the workers, all the supply chains, all the markets, and that India is not going to help them, right? And that that is just so emblematic of how they behave, that they think that they're rising power, that they can treat everyone, including people they really need, like India, as underlings and boss them around and insult them. And they're not winning any friends. Of course, wolf warrior diplomacy, they're trying to temper it down a little bit, but they just can't help themselves on a lot of these things. So it's not that the United States is perfect. It's not that everyone loves us or will love us. But China is managing to piss everyone off to such a great extent, and also presents an economic threat to virtually everyone, right? In recent months, you've seen not just the United States and Europe institute tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and batteries, but you've seen countries like Turkey, Brazil, India, and others institute tariffs on that as well. Countries that are part of the BRICS or looking to join the BRICS doing that. Why? Because they're not excited about their domestic manufacturing getting destroyed by overcapacity in China, right? Yeah. So we have a really interesting moment where we can get more and more people on our side, not because they love us, and many people won't love us, and we've certainly done our share of dumb things, particularly in the last couple of decades, but because they simply fear China more, right? We don't need to be loved. We just need for people to hate China more, and that is completely doable, and I think that is the winning policy for the U.S. Over the coming decade.
So one of the big strengths, of course, for the United States is the vibrant private sector that we have. So how do you think about how government and private sector can collaborate to more effectively address some of the complex cybersecurity challenges that we've just been discussing?
Well, this is really a key issue because when it comes to threats to our critical infrastructure, you really have most of that critical infrastructure being run by the private sector, right? And the government having really limited ability, maybe through regulations, but no other ability to help secure it. And I believe that we need to be much more integrated in our defensive posture with the private sector, where the government needs to realize that the private sector is not just a victim, is not just someone you tell what to do, but they have unique capabilities, unique visibilities, particularly the cybersecurity industry, particularly some of the large cloud providers. And there needs to be a true partnership between government agencies and private sector entities where they can cooperate on some things where it makes sense. They won't on others where there's proprietary information or concerns around privacy, etc. But we need to be deeper integrated in accomplishing our joint objectives, which is making sure that this country remains safe, secure, and prosperous.
Dmitri, do you think that the U.S. or the West generally has the cybersecurity talent required to offset the threats? It seems like there's a shortage.
Well, there's always a shortage. You always want more, but we absolutely have the best people in the world. Look, I've built one of the largest cybersecurity companies on the planet, CrowdStrike, and much of our workforce, particularly technical workforce, was in the United States, and when it wasn't, it was in Europe and other friendly countries. So this remains the best place to recruit talent, to find the best companies in the world, right? All the top cybersecurity companies are here in the United States. That is not an accident. So, this is something that I think is often underappreciated, is how strong America is, particularly in comparison to China, right? I talk in the book about the 5 I advantages, not the 5 Is, which is, of course, the U.S. intelligence partnership with UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, but the 5 Is of innovation, investment, influence, ideas, and immigration, right? On the innovation side, the top universities, the top companies are all in the United States. When President Xi wanted to send his daughter to study in college, where did he send her? To Harvard, right? So he didn't send her to university in China. No one is rushing to go to Chinese universities, or even frankly European universities are lagging far behind. On the investment side, we have more investment capacity per capita than anywhere else on earth. We have over 10,000 banks and credit unions, thousands of venture firms, private equity firms, family offices, way more than anywhere else on the planet. So if you want to start a company and get funding for it, this is the best place in the world for it. At CrowdStrike, we raised $1.1 billion through our IPO. We couldn't have succeeded and become the company that it is today without that funding. And we have the beauty of a single market where selling a widget or a technology in Seattle is no different than selling in Alabama. That is not true, let's say, in Europe, where you have a single market, but really selling in Finland is so different from selling to Italy or Spain, right? Not just language barriers, but go-to-market strategies and so forth. The influence that we have of the U.S. dollar that remains, despite all the attempts to displace it, the world's reserve currency, unassailable in many ways. The U.S. military remains the strongest military. The alliances that we have are the strongest in the world, unprecedented in human history. The ideas, the marketplace of ideas that is really enshrined in our Constitution, our government framework, where dissent and civil disagreement is not just acceptable, but expected in our system, right? It's something that these authoritarian regimes really suffer from because, they may get a dictator that's really smart, that's really innovative, that's going to drive their country forward for a few decades, like Deng Xiaoping did with China, for example, and was responsible for this incredible economic miracle. But then you run out of those ideas and you focus on electing leaders that may be strongmen but don't have a deep understanding of economics, like Xi Jinping, for example, who has been hugely detrimental to the Chinese economy, right? And there's no way to throw him out like we have in our democratic electoral system. And finally, immigration, right? Immigration has become, unfortunately, a dirty word in this country, in part because we do need, I think, get control of our borders and make sure that illegal immigration is not out of control. But when it comes to merit-based immigration program, we are totally missing the boat because the best and the brightest people still want to come to this country to build companies, to get a great education, to get great jobs, and it's very difficult for them to do so in a legal fashion. Scott Galloway, NYU professor, has this great quote that every year there's a draft for human capital, and every year the U.S. gets the top picks, but most of the time we don't actually let them in, right? And that we do need to solve. But the fact that this remains a beacon for the world population to come and build better lives for themselves and their children is an incredible advantage that we should be taking more advantage of.
Yeah, that's great, Dmitri. I think sometimes we tend to focus on the negatives, the things that could go wrong, and we forget about the enormous strengths that America brings. If I could sort of here in closing ask you to think back on your career, and you've had sort of multiple careers here, what are the most significant lessons you've learned about cybersecurity and geopolitics? And in particular, what advice would you give to aspiring cybersecurity professionals? We have a lot of students and people just entering the job market to listen to the podcast. What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, I would tell them that yes, technical education is really important. I think STEM education, computer science, understanding how these AI technologies work is really, really important. But the importance of understanding policy, understanding how to communicate, cannot be overstated. The reality is that you can be the best technical person in the world, the best coder, etc. If you can't communicate your ideas, if you can't communicate and argue for the things that should be done, you will not be successful in any company, right? And those interpersonal skills, I think, sometimes get downplayed for people that go into the technical careers, and later on they tend to regret that they haven't spent more time on that. So I had the benefit early on in my career in college to not just study cybersecurity or information security, as it was called at the time at Georgia Tech, but also study international affairs and do a lot of policy writings. And I thought I'd never use it once I joined the job markets and started working in cybersecurity. But lo and behold, in Aurora days in 2010, I was briefing policymakers. I was spending time thinking through policy strategies for how to respond to these problems, building a company, raising money, right, where you need to communicate, you need to articulate your ideas. So really want to make sure that people that are going into technical fields appreciate that taking English courses, taking writing courses, taking public speaking courses is something that is absolutely invaluable, and those skills will be beneficial to you throughout your entire life.
Dmitri, that's a great way to end, and it's I say very similar things to my students at both at Yale and at the Bush School. If you can think critically, if you can write, and then if you can communicate, it's a trifecta, right?
It's so rare these days, and particularly with AI, the importance of technical skills may in some ways diminish over time because you have this incredible power in your phone, on your computer, in your browser that can answer any questions and increasingly start coding for you, etc. If you're mediocre at a technical skill, you likely will be replaced by those technologies. But if you can communicate, if you can come up with new ideas, those skills, I think, will be evergreen.
Dmitri, thanks. It was a great discussion. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Dmitri Alperovitch. I'm Andy Makritis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters. And you can always reach us at intelligencematterspod@gmail.com.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.